You're listening to episode 81 of Literacy in Color. Today's episode has gone international as we're joined by our wonderful guest from Ireland, Deirdre O'Toole. Dee is a brilliant educator, a current doctoral student, and the founder of the Playful Classroom, as well as the Right to Read Ireland. Her PhD research focuses on early literacy acquisition, specifically around articulatory gestures and how attention to speech production supports phonemic awareness and the acquisition of grapheme phoneme correspondences. In this episode, we're diving into what articulatory gestures even are, if there's any research behind sound walls, how visual speech cues support learning, and why something as simple as look at my mouth might be a powerful instructional move in your classroom. If you've ever been curious about how sound walls work or how articulation connects to phonemic awareness, this episode is for you. Welcome to the Literacy in Color podcast. I'm your host, Michelle Sullivan, a science of reading advocate with over a decade of experience as a reading interventionist and literacy coach. I'm passionate about making evidence-based instruction both effective and engaging. If you're interested in captivating our learners on reading fluently and understanding language, or as I like to call it, keeping it colorful, then you've found the right place. Each week, we'll explore intriguing lit bits and practical strategies around the science of reading and structured literacy to help you be colorful and teach colorfully. Are you ready to bring literacy to life? Let's color outside the lines and make an impact together. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Literacy in Color. We have a wonderful guest from over the pond in Ireland, a good friend, Deirdre O'Toole, and she is the face behind the Playful Classroom and a true science of reading advocate who also runs the Facebook page, The Science of Reading Discussion for Irish Teachers, as well as she has her foot in some conference planning that I'm sure she's going to share some more about. She's also a fellow content creator behind the Teachers Table, and I've got to connect with her in person at the Reading League. So it's truly a pleasure to have her on the show and have her share her expertise around her PhD work. And she is very knowledgeable in the primary grades. In Ireland, they call them the infants, right? Mm-hmm. She's going to share a bit about foundational knowledge, especially around articulation today. So I like to say to my Irish friends, Céad Míle Fáilte, and I'm so happy to have you here today, Dee.
Wow, I'm so impressed, not just with the Céad Míle Fáilte, which is 100,000 welcomes, but also you pronounced Deirdre correctly. Like, I get called all sorts of things. So that's why I go by Dee, because it's just easier. Yes. But thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here. It's great to connect with you in person at Reading League. This is the wonderful thing about conferences, but also really valuing all of the online connections as well.
Yeah, I love to think about some of the closest friends I have in my life are because of Instagram these days. And it's just wonderful to have your like-minded friends just a click away.
Absolutely.
Maybe you can share a little bit about your background in education and how you got to the place you are today.
So I've been teaching since 2005. That's when I did my B.Ed, or when I qualified. So I was in the classroom for quite a long time. And then a few years ago, I started a master's in literacy education and very quickly switched to a PhD instead, which wasn't the original intention, but look, it's how things go. And I want to say no regrets, but I'm in the middle of data analysis, so that's a whole barrel of laughs. Once I started studying, I realized that working full-time was going to be difficult while studying as well. So I took a career break. So I've been 3 years officially out of the classroom. I do plan on going back. But in that time, I've gotten to do lots of other things as well, with a bit more flexibility than the usual school calendar. I do webinars for teachers through our education centres in Ireland. I also do workshops and work with some schools as well as the Teachers Table and TPT and all of those other things as well.
Yeah, it's hard to balance all of those things at the same time when you're only one person, right?
Exactly, as well, you know. But I've taught most grades in Ireland. We're kind of generalist teachers. We go from kind of pre-K to sixth grade ish. That's our primary school, we call it. And the first 2 years we call infants, which is kind of like junior kindergarten and senior kindergarten. But you can teach any grade, so I've taught most of them. So my experience is quite varied, but I really, really love the little ones. That's where my passion is.
It's a magical age. That's my favorite level as well. And then you're also planning the Right to Read Ireland conference. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I'm very excited. This has really grown legs. I had a WhatsApp group called The Right to Read. It was just different people I connected with through Facebook and on Instagram, just different teachers around Ireland. So that was running in the background. And then a couple of years ago, I went to Plain Talk conference in New Orleans and I met Lynn Stone from Australia. And Lynn, as you know, is absolutely wonderful. But she contacted me afterwards and she said, do you think there'd be any interest in me running some workshops in Ireland? And I was like, okay, leave it with me. And then she came and her workshops like sold out in minutes. She was like the Taylor Swift of literacy. So she came back a second time and then she came back a third time. So she's done lots and lots of workshops around Ireland. And the interest from teachers in Ireland has been just incredible. And then I've been very lucky. I've been able to go to the likes of Plain Talk or the Reading League or IDA Ontario. And these wonderful conferences that are really practitioner focused, but still with that evidence base. I'm like, I really wish other teachers could come. I wish we had this in Ireland. So Lynn said, well, how about when I'm over, we get some more people to come? I was like, okay, let's do it. And then I asked some people and they started saying yes. And I was like, okay, this is a runner. And I roped in my friends from that WhatsApp group, and we have a fantastic committee. And now we have a conference for almost 400 people happening on the 21st of March with speakers like Pam Snow, Devin Kearns, Molly Ness, Holly Lane, plus some wonderful Irish speakers as well. So we've really great variety. I'm very excited about it.
Yeah, it looks amazing. Every time you post a new speaker, I'm just more and more enticed to buy my plane ticket. So I think next year I'm going to have to try to plan it on my calendar.
Absolutely.
Wonderful things on the horizon. And then you're working on a PhD right now and particularly focused on articulatory gestures. So how did you decide on that for your topic?
Yeah, it wasn't my initial choice. And I think when you pick a topic for your PhD, you know, it's very likely you'll change it. What it looks like at the beginning of the journey is very different to how the journey actually pans out. I knew it was going to be something around early literacy, but it was really sound walls that I was interested in because I kept seeing stuff online about science of reading, sound walls. And I was like, is it actually science of reading? Like, is there research there? I'd used a sound wall myself for a number of years in the classroom, and I had found it to be really beneficial, but I knew that there wasn't a consensus in the science of reading on it. So I said, well, GAP is a good place to start with a thesis. So that's what I did. So for my research study, I used 4 schools and I looked at the pre-kindergarten children. So they're kind of 4/5. And I assessed them at the beginning of the year and at the end of the year using Dibbles. So I have a lot of really great data there. And I had different conditions with sound walls, without sound walls, and so on. But what has been most interesting actually has been looking at the literature and seeing what is actually there. Because to my knowledge, nobody's ever actually done a systematic review or a meta-analysis on articulatory gestures, and definitely not on sound walls. So it's been very, very interesting.
So interesting. I'm going to be so excited to see your final thesis and what you have to share at the end of your PhD journey, because so many times we see things slapped, science of reading aligned sticker on it, when sometimes that's not necessarily the case. And it's not to say a sound wall is good or bad, but it hasn't been researched. So when we're sticking true to what is in the research, I think we have to be mindful of our language language as well. And what there is research on is articulation, right? And that is what you have become quite an expert on. And before we dive into articulation in particular, maybe we can dive into some of those really foundational skills that are necessary for our earliest readers. So we often see that phonemic awareness and knowledge of the alphabetic principle are really essential components, some of the strongest predictors of future reading success for our little ones. So maybe we can start the conversation by defining each of those things. Like, how would you define phonemic awareness and the alphabetic principle? And sometimes people confuse the alphabetic principle with just knowledge of the alphabet. And there is slight nuance to that as well, right?
Absolutely. It's funny because you'd have asked me 10 years ago what was phonemic awareness. I wouldn't have been able to tell you. If you asked me what phonological awareness was, I'd have said, rhyming and syllables. So that was common enough. I think even though there was a lot of research there, it wasn't very well known about, but we've definitely seen this massive interest in phonemic awareness over the last couple of years, and rightly so. As I've been researching, I've been going back to papers from the 1960s and 1970s, and that was really when it all started to come about. So it's taken a while to get to the classroom, but we're getting there now. So phonemic awareness, really the key word for me is conscious awareness. So we do have this inherent unconscious awareness of the sounds of our language. And that all happens in your first year of life, your exposure to language and just being surrounded by it. So you know about all of the sounds in your language, but you're not conscious of them because obviously you're a baby. But even then, when you're 4, when you're 5, you start school, you never had to think about these sounds. We know about words. That's a lamp. That's a computer, but we don't think about the sounds. You don't have to. There's no reason for it. The alphabetic principle then is a different angle. Language is biologically primary, as Pam Snow would call it, something that we just pick up by being surrounded by it, but reading is not. Reading is that recent invention. So going back to the Phoenicians and the origin of the alphabet, we had symbols and hieroglyphics and all that beforehand and logos. And then they said, well, no, actually, we want to break it down even further. So they matched up the letters with these individual speech sounds. And that was a huge invention. And really, that's the core of our written language. There are other aspects, of course, like morphology, and we have all these spelling conventions because the written language and our spoken language has changed over time. But at the foundation of our written language, letters represent speech sounds. So the grapheme is representing the phoneme. So that's the crux of it. And of course, kids don't know that when they start school. So we need to make them consciously aware of the sounds so that they can match them up with the letters or the graphemes.
That was a really helpful description. And I love this idea of a consciousness. Maybe we should call it phonemic consciousness.
Yeah, I think so.
But it's so true. We don't walk around just uttering speech sounds. We're uttering words. But how do we then use that knowledge to read and to spell? And we have to have a level of phonemic awareness to do that kind of work. And when we're thinking about the implementation piece and how teachers can foster building phonemic awareness and then a knowledge of the alphabetic principle in our primary level classrooms, what are some things that you would hope to see teachers saying or to see students doing?
Well, the jury is out on phonological sensitivity, those larger units of sound. Like, do we need to work on syllables before we work on phonemes? There is a longitudinal study happening on that, and I'm very excited about the Project Opal. But the jury is out on that. There's conflicting research. But we do know for sure we need to foster that phonemic awareness and that conscious awareness of it. You can do it in a very playful way. There's lots of lovely activities that you can do. Even when the children are lining up, you can say, okay, next I'm calling Michelle, just to work on that initial sound isolation. But I do think there is a place for the explicit instruction as well. Like, we can do things incidentally, and teachers naturally do. You know, we're singing nursery rhymes and playing with language. But to make sure that we're not losing anybody, I do think we need that explicit piece as well. Now, the research shows that we don't want to spend too long doing this just orally. So there was a meta-analysis from last year. You might put in the show notes, our Belly and colleagues. And it showed that after 10 hours of oral phonemic awareness, really you're not getting the same gains. But up to 10 hours is okay. So 5-10 minutes a day in that junior kindergarten, I think can be really useful. And I'm going to mention a program here that there's been a lot of controversy about, but I do want to talk about it, and that's Hegarty, which is an oral program, and it has come under a lot of fire because you could run Hegarty for 10 minutes a day for 3 years, pre-kindergarten, kindergarten, first grade, and that is completely unnecessary because that's going way over the 10 hours. But I know for teachers in Ireland in particular, but it's probably been the same in the States, who are fumbling around in the dark, not knowing how to teach phonemic awareness. This manual was a godsend because it told them exactly what to do and say every day. Do you need to implement the whole program? Absolutely not. There are skills there that don't really need to be done, like the manipulation skills don't need to be done orally. But the isolation, the blending, segmenting tasks in that are laid out for you day by day. So that's actually really, really useful for a teacher who doesn't have the knowledge or who doesn't have the confidence. If you have the knowledge and the confidence in what you're doing, well then no, you don't need Hegarty. But if you're teaching that junior kindergarten and you want to tune them into the sounds and make sure they're really ready for their phonics instruction, well then 5 minutes of that a day for one term for a couple of months could be really, really useful.
I'm so glad you said that too, because I feel like a lot of times things can get under a lot of heat. And I think what has happened in the science of reading movement is all of the sudden people learned, oh my goodness, explicit phonics instruction and phonemic awareness are so important. And so people start doing it and people start getting Hegarty and implementing. And then they're like, oh, wait, too much.
Yeah.
Scale back. We have to scale back. But to me, I think it's always going to be this fine dance of implementation as a teacher and what your students need. And if your students as a whole are showing a lot of success with phonemic awareness, by middle of first grade, perhaps they don't need it anymore. And then you dial back. But I do see a lot of value in doing oral activities, especially pre-K, before they know letter sounds yet. People often say we have to tie phonemic awareness to print as well. And there's value in both. There's value
Absolutely.
depending on the situation and depending on the students. And not everything is so black and white in all scenarios all of the time. And to look at situations and nuance and types of students being utilized in research, I think all of it's important to look at. And I think the Project Opal is going to be really interesting to see down the road. Dr. Sheen Piasta spoke at the Reading League. I see she's one of your presenters at your conference as well.
Yeah, I'm excited for the Irish teachers to hear from Dr. Piasta because she really knows the research. People will say, oh, you should do this, you should do that, or the National Reading Panel said this. First of all, the National Reading Panel was 25 years ago. And second of all, like I say, there's context and nuance, and it's not always this or that. Sometimes it's this and that, maybe a little bit of this and more of that, depending on who's in front of you and what they need.
Yes, absolutely. And maybe now we can tap into the articulatory gestures specifically. So that's a big fancy term, articulation, articulatory gestures. So how would you define that in the context of early literacy instruction?
So articulatory gestures, like it is a mouthful, but that's quite apt because we're talking about the mouth. So it's how we produce these phonemes, these speech sounds. So all of the movements within our articulatory mechanism, so from our lungs right up to our mouth and our nose, and how all these parts work together to produce speech sounds. And phonetics and phonology, it's quite an interesting science, actually. I find it really fascinating. And what got me interested in it first actually was doing letters training. And I remember having this aha moment about the sounds of the letter S and how the S and Z are kind of interchangeable when it comes to the letter S. It just blew my mind that these two sounds were produced in the same way in the mouth. The only difference was the voicing. So with articulation, we're looking at what the jaw is doing, the tongue, the teeth, the lips, and even the passage of air coming out through either the mouth or the nose. But also we're looking at the voice box. And anyone who's using the likes of UFly Phonics program, they'll be familiar with this voicing and unvoicing. But this was quite new to me, and just everything just all of a sudden made sense. So the vocal cords may or may not be vibrating depending on what sound you're producing. Now in connected speech, they're buzzing all the time. But if we say a particular sound on its own, like the t sound, that's a stop sound. It's not one that we would ever say on its own in normal speech. We don't go around, unless you're a kindergarten teacher, you don't go around saying t, t, t. But for that sound, my vocal cords actually aren't engaged. They're not vibrating. So that's an unvoiced sound. But its voiced partner is the d, like the letter D. So those two sounds, the mouth is doing the exact same thing for both of them. The only difference is the voicing. And you might think, well, I mean, I didn't know that. So is it really important for kids to know? But actually, the more that you know about these things, the more attuned you can be to the difficulties that children have and the mistakes that they make. And things just really start to make sense, particularly for English language learners. That's something that I've really learned a lot about. It wasn't a topic that was ever top of my list, but I find it really fascinating because every language has different phonemes and even different dialects as well.
Express Readers decodable books have a special format with positive and complete storylines, highly controlled text, extra spacing and enlarged font to support all learners, and relatable, lovable characters. The books are colorful and durable, and the stories have a sense of humor with engaging, recurring characters to keep student interest. Express Readers decodables provide the perfect place to apply learned phonics skills, support fluency building, and foster a love for reading. With alignments to most core foundational curricula and in-depth decodable book guides, educators can feel prepared without losing any prep time to create or plan on their own, nor any added costs. Be sure to check out the link in the show notes and ask for your free sample at www.expressreaders.org today.
But in terms of the instruction in the classroom, it can be part of your phonemic awareness instruction and it can be part of your phonics instruction as well. So drawing the children's attention to what is happening in their mouths by literally showing them, saying, look at my mouth, copy what I'm doing, or showing them pictures of mouths forming the sound, or giving them little mirrors so that they can look at their own mouths. And kids love looking at themselves. So that's something that actually goes down very well. But it's not something extra that you add on, like I'm going to do 5 minutes of articulation every day. It's embedded in your phonemic awareness or your phonics instruction. Because some people would say, well, we don't have time for that. We've too many other things to be doing. But it's not time. It's just part of it. And once you have the knowledge, it just becomes kind of natural. So I do think it is knowledge that teachers should have. But for example, if you're introducing a new letter sound correspondence, so say we're learning the sound, the short E, you'd be showing them the letter, obviously, you'd be telling them what the sound is, you'd be thinking about words that would have the sound in it or words that begin with the sound. But at that point, you say, look at my mouth, as I say the sound, and that's really key, is getting them to look at you. And that was something we discovered during COVID. That was really important. And then you're getting them to produce it as well. So they're listening to it and then they're producing it. You can go down the route of telling them exactly what their teeth, tongue, lips are doing. But I wouldn't say that's an essential piece, particularly not in the mainstream classroom.
And that's another thing with nuance. That might be a great intervention to someone who is having difficulty with production or with hearing those sounds, that you can tap into that one-on-one or a small group as well. And those are really wonderful examples. And I think it's also really helpful when we think about our language as these utterances of words, right? Sometimes the articulation of certain sounds get muddled because of that co-articulation, because it's blending with other sounds or syllables. And even examples like a word like butter, Utter, it's spelled with two T's. All of a sudden, when I say it, sounds like the D sound, right? Butter. And when you look at the production of sounds to say like, hey, wait, it sounds like that because it's partner in terms of voicing. And one has a voice box on and one has a voice box off. And sometimes when we speak it in an utterance, the sound can get muffled a little bit, but there's a reason behind that.
And that's where I think the sound wall can be really useful, whether it's a display in your classroom or individual ones that the children might have, say, in special ed. Pointing it out to the child can be very affirming for them. You're not just making this random mistake. When you spelled the word butter, B-U-D-R, there's a reason for that. It's not just that you spelled it wrong. You were spelling what you heard, which is the right thing to do in the beginning. But look, the letter D spells D. And yeah, it does sound like that, but also its partner is the T sound. And also, kids will mix up things that have similar articulation. So it mightn't be the voiced and unvoiced pairs, but it could be things like and n. They're two nasal sounds. And again, very commonly mixed up by kids. Nasal meaning that the air is coming out through the nose rather than the mouth. So kids are more likely to mix them up. But again, if you're helping them with reading or spelling and they're making that mistake, you can point it out. Look at the sound wall. Look, they're both nasal sounds. They're both both nose sounds, whatever you want to call them. They're beside each other on the sound wall. So that's why you mix them up. And particularly for those ELL kids as well, with the vowels can be the most problematic. So like the E, like an eagle, and I, as in igloo. I mean, they're so close. There's such a subtle difference between them. If you're used to it, if you've heard English since birth, you can hear the difference between E and I. But if you come from a home that speaks Spanish or Ukrainian, those two sounds are the same. They're exactly the same. And it's the same for us speaking English. In other language, there are sounds that we cannot discriminate between. Like in French, two words like tu, like tu, or tu, T-O-U-S, to me, they sound exactly the same, but to a French person, they sound completely different. So I think it's particularly affirming for the kids and helpful for the teacher to know that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm appreciative of you speaking about English language learners, or just the vast majority of Englishes out there, because even you and I have a different pronunciation for certain sounds, but we can match our pronunciation to a sound wall, even if there's slight nuance to it. And it's not necessarily that there's one perfect pronunciation. It depends on the region that you live in and matching that speech to the print.
Well, I was laughing when you picked butter as an example, because that is one of those ones that we say differently. In Ireland, we don't flap so much, but we have different little quirks that we do instead. But dialect is really fascinating, actually. And something I've come to learn, that we respect all dialects, we respect all languages. There is no one right way to speak English. It's not like the Queen's English is the right and correct way. In linguistics, we celebrate them all, and we study the differences, and we change as language evolves, dialects evolve, accents evolve. We're celebrating everybody, which is a nice way to be.
Yeah, it gives everyone an entry point.
Mm-hmm.
So when students really are struggling with paying attention to individual phonemes, why do you think that is?
Well, look, kids start school, there's a multitude of things going on, especially in recent years. I know most teachers would be in agreement when I say, attention spans are not getting any better. They're, it's more difficult to engage the kids for sure. And there's a multitude of reasons for that, whether it's sensory reasons, whether it's screen time, whether it's too many children in the class, whatever the reason might be. But I do really believe that if we get the children on the right track from the beginning, it will make a big difference. It's going to prevent difficulties for a lot of kids down the line. Look, I mean, we don't need to talk about the school to prison pipeline, but we know that incarceration rates of illiteracy are very high. That's not necessarily due to dyslexia. That could be for another reason, that maybe that child wasn't ready to access the learning when they started school and they missed out on those foundations. So I think when you are starting your phonics instruction, one of the ways of just making sure that you have the children engaged is look at my mouth when I'm saying this sound. And there was a study done during COVID, which was really fascinating, by Christina Novelli and colleagues, where they had one condition where the children learned letter sound correspondences from a teacher who wore a mask, and a condition where the teacher didn't wear a mask. And it was a very clear difference between the two groups. The children who had the teacher who wasn't wearing a mask learned the grapheme phoneme correspondences quicker and more efficiently. So there is definitely something there. There's something about that multimodality, I think, that the children they're engaging more. They're not just listening to the sound, because the sound is so abstract. Like, what is what is it? It's, and even that word sound, I don't like to use the word sound. I prefer phoneme, because this is something that we're using for our reading. It's not just a sound, which is kind of ephemeral.
A musical note. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Like, what is a sound? We could be listening to the wind. We could be listening to the students in the next classroom, or somebody walking down the corridor. So phoneme really kind of helps us tune in, and then getting the kids to look at it and pay attention to the mouth is helping to anchor it and kind of make that connection.
Yeah, absolutely. And that research is so interesting too, because you mentioned one of the issues that teachers are facing is just the uptick of screen time for so many of our students. And you think about even, and with no judgment, parents who have their children on iPads and they grow up watching videos, they're exposed to language, but they are not exposed to that human experience of seeing that mouth movement. And there's a difference between having a conversation with a child and them watching a video, and being able to see the nuance and articulation, I think, in the flesh is a difference, not even with a mask covered. But
we learned that during COVID, like trying to teach online or trying to teach with a mask, it just wasn't the same. So that human connection piece is so important.
Yeah. And then what are some of the other interesting research out there about articulatory gestures? I'm sure you have
quite
tons.
interesting. Yeah, I've really gone deep into the research, like I say, back to the 60s and 70s. Nobody that I know of has done a systematic review or a meta-analysis on this. So really, I did have to spend a lot of time wading through the literature to find the stuff. There was quite a lot there, actually, more than I thought. So going back to the 60s with the Lindamoods. So Charles and Patricia Lindamood really spearheaded all of this. They realized that children who were having reading difficulties were having some sort of auditory difficulties as well. And they said, well, let's look at this. So they developed a test called Auditory Discrimination in Depth, and then developed the program, which later became LIPS, or the Lindamood Phoneme Sequencing Program. So people may be familiar with that, but it's very old. And it has evolved over time as well, which is a good sign. We don't like it when programs just stay the same and never change. We have to evolve. But really it was created for kind of one-to-one intervention for children with reading difficulties, and often older children as well. So a lot of the research is looking at that, children with difficulties, either small group or one-to-one. There's really no research in the whole class setting. So my research was in the whole class setting, but it's very small scale solo researcher, so it's not really what you'd call top tier evidence or anything. But the research is quite clear. The LIPS program, and most of the studies looked at the LIPS program. There was a couple of other ones around, but most of them, probably 80% of them, looked at LIPS. It is a good program. It works. It improves phonemic awareness. It improves reading. It improves spelling. However, this is the caveat. When you compare it to another program or another intervention that looks at phonemic awareness and teaches the children blending and decoding and all of that, but doesn't include the articulatory gestures, it's not necessarily any better. So it's a way that works. Is it the best way? The research doesn't show that. So no, it's probably not the best way. There is no one best way. It's like the different approaches to teaching phonics. Well, we know systematic is best, but we've synthetic phonics, analytic phonics, linguistic phonics. They're all great. So it's the same with the articulatory gestures or the articulatory training or the mouth, using the mouth pictures. Yeah, it's good. It works. Is it essential? Not really. Could it be more beneficial for some kids than others? It could. And that's where the research isn't clear. There isn't sufficient, I suppose, research to show, okay, children kindergarten age are going to benefit best, or children who have reading difficulties are going to benefit the most from it. And pretty much none of the studies looked at ELLs as a variable. So we don't know. Like, I think that it is beneficial for ELLs, but the research just hasn't been done on that. So there's definitely a lot of scope. There's a lot of room for more research here, particularly when it comes to the use of the sound wall. So there's no research on sound walls. Like I said, there's plenty of studies on lips and similar programs, but not on sound walls at all. I suppose they're a recent enough invention, but it's also hard to isolate the use of a sound wall. How do you show that the children are using it? Because it could be up on a wall, but not necessarily being used. That's pointless, really. But you would have to really get into the nitty gritty with a very specific study to determine if the sound wall is actually going to be beneficial or not.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's so interesting. And I always like to say, whatever goes up on your wall should have wall power. It shouldn't be wallpaper. And if it's just a display, there's going to have no instructional power behind it. So it does take a highly trained teacher to learn a little about articulation. And that's something that a lot of teachers, unless you've had something like letters training, or if you've done something that teaches you about articulation, you might not necessarily know too much about. So it's going to be interesting to see down the road if anything comes down the pipe about the usage of sound walls, or how they're used for reading or spelling or sound drills or connections to letter sound correspondences. So it's going to be exciting to see.
Yeah, I think there are some studies going on, but again, to get to the point where we can say this is definitely something that you have to have in your classroom, that would take a lot of research. So it could be quite some time. But like you said, I mean, there's no point in it being there if you're not going to use it. Children do reference it. If a teacher references it, the children will as well. That's something I've seen anecdotally. I haven't studied it, but in my own research study, it's something I observed. If they're looking for particular grapheme or spelling, they will reference the sound wall, but that is down to the teacher. So it's certainly not a bad thing, that's for sure. But can we say that a sound wall is science of reading aligned? Not really.
Yeah. And I mean, I've used one myself and I have found success with it. And I think you can have personal anecdotes and you can see for yourself, do you even find it a useful tool? So maybe we could even dive into the components of a sound wall in case someone might not be familiar with it and how it would differ than from something like a word wall, which is kind of your classic bulletin board in a elementary setting.
Yeah, so it is quite different, really. The sound wall should include all of the phonemes of the English language or whatever dialect of English you're speaking. And Irish English has slight differences from American English, but around 44-ish phonemes. So each one gets a place on the sound wall. We have our vowels separate to our consonants. And when we're thinking of vowels and consonants, we're thinking in terms of sounds rather than letters. So English has quite a number of vowels, around 18, which that's a lot considering we've only got 5 vowel letters. So that's where most of the problems emerge, unfortunately. But every phoneme has a place. Now, whether that is represented with a picture of a mouth or a picture of a keyword, this is where sound walls can vary. Probably the most common would be the mouth pictures, but I did include in my study a sound wall that had keyword pictures instead. So for the g sound, you might have a picture of the mouth going g, but another one might have a picture of a goat instead. And then underneath that, you will have your relevant grapheme or graphemes. So for the g sound, it's just going to be a G. There's no other way to spell it, but if we have the A, the long A sound, we've got A on its own, we can have AI, we can have AY. For some of the vowels, you're talking multiple. Now, we're not going to extremes. We're not going to teach them every possible spelling for every sound. I think the consensus is maybe 70 to 80 graphemes in total is sufficient. Now, that's still a lot on your sound wall, but you wouldn't have them all there in the beginning. Usually with a sound wall, you're starting with just the pictures. So because the children have all the sounds, all the phonemes on their speech, so they're used to hearing them, not used to thinking about them, but they certainly know them all. But then as you learn each grapheme phoneme correspondence, so we're learning the letter S spells S. So we find our S picture on the sound wall and we're going to add the letter S underneath it. This is one way of spelling that sound. Usually we'd start with the most common way. With most phonics programs will go by frequency. So over time, you're adding to it. So it's not this display that goes up and it stays up. It's a working display. It evolves with the children. So what it might look like at the beginning of kindergarten would be very different to how it might look at the end of first grade when they've learned, you know, alternative spellings for some of the sounds and you've got a really full sound wall. So there are little kind of differences in how people do it. There's no, like say, one correct way because the research isn't there on that. But what we're looking at is the sounds of the language, the speech sounds of the language, and how each of those is represented in writing or, you know, in written words. That's the alphabetic principle. So that's really what it's supporting, I suppose.
Wonderful. And then how does it differ from a word wall?
Well, the word wall traditionally, I suppose, would be organized in a particular way that would be more to do with the orthography of the letters, the spelling, rather than the sounds. So you might have an alphabetic word wall where you're adding words as you come across them. So under the letter S, you might have sun, but you might also have shop. Or you might have a word wall that just has all of your high frequency words in the order in which you have introduced them. That's something that I would have had over the years. And we would practice them every day. I'd have my pointer and I'd point to the word and I'd say, this is the word are. Everyone say are. Or this is the word was. Everyone say was. And that was how I used that. We drilled it. That's a very, very different thing. Or some people might have a vocabulary kind of wall instead, and that is definitely useful, but that's not really for our phonics instruction. So the sound wall is very much incorporated into our phonics instruction. It's not, now we're going to do sound wall time. It is throughout the lesson that you're referencing it with the hope then that the children will reference it themselves as well.
That's such a great tip. And then when we think about supporting students in different arenas like reading or spelling, what might be a way, say a student is struggling to spell a word in their writing, what might be some teacher language or prompt that you might use in a certain scenario?
I'll say if they're writing independently and maybe they're writing the word play, I find that's one that kids often include, like, I like to play, or I played with my friend. So they're segmenting it, play, p, l, a. So they write the P, the L, and then they're like A. Now, depending on what stage they're at, say if it was kindergarten, they might say, teacher, how do you spell the A sound? And then you would say, well, actually, we haven't learned that one yet. So I'm going to show you on the sound wall. Here's the A. And actually in the word play, we spell it AY. Okay, we're going to do that lesson another day, but for you to write that word, there you go. Or they might just write the letter A, which is probably the most likely thing to happen. And that's fine, because that is our way of spelling the A sound. But if, say, it's first grade, they are writing the word play and they've got the P, the L, and they know that, there are different ways to spell A. I know that we have learned different ways to spell it, but I'm not sure which one to use in this word. So they look up at the sound wall, they find the A sound, and they look underneath and they see AI, and then they say, I know I can't go at the end of the word, so it's not going to be that one. And then they see AY and they go, it must be that instead. Or it could be that they look at the order of frequency and say, well, it's most likely going to be spelled that way, so I'll use that one. So say with the sound, it can be spelled E or I or U or. In all likelihood, it's going to be E or. So, that's a good guess. So if they're, working independently and they can't ask you for help, they write the E or. That's probably a good attempt. So it really depends on what stage the children are at. They write something based on kind of their accent or their dialect. You can say, well, look, I can see what you did there, because the T and the D are partners, so they're right beside each other on the sound wall. So that's why you have that. So in this word, we're going to use the T or whatever it might be.
I love that tip. This has been such a wonderful conversation to help connect our graphemes to our phonemes to our graphemes. And I think this work is especially helpful when we're thinking about our single syllable words that are more commonly representative for sound to symbol. Even if you have some orthographic conventions like vowel teams working together, when you learn the code in single syllable words, it tends to be fairly consistent. And then once we get into multisyllabic words, sometimes we have schwas, sometimes, we have vowel flexing that has to happen. Sometimes we have letters that are representative of history, and we have to look at a little bit of, etymology can be helpful in cases morphology. But to have a solid grasp of sound symbol relationships is so foundational to the primary level classroom, and tapping into articulation and using the sound wall as a tool, if you find it useful, I think can all be really powerful in your instruction. And this has been such an enlightening conversation. You're clearly very knowledgeable about all of this. I'm excited to hear more about your PhD journey. And maybe you just want to leave teachers with a little bit of advice if they're thinking about how they can better support students with their speech sounds. What might be a small shift that you would recommend, or a little nugget of wisdom to share their way?
I would say it doesn't have to be, go out and buy a sound wall or go out and start printing all of these pictures right now. It doesn't have to be like that. It can be as simple as look at my mouth. And that's a very small shift that could make a big difference for some children, particularly if engagement is difficult. Look at my mouth and listen to this sound. So that multimodality piece, I think, can make a big difference. And I just want to point it out as well, because we kind of didn't really mention it. You definitely don't need sound walls in upper elementary. Like I said, it's that foundational piece. It's grapheme phoneme correspondences. We have to get that solid. There's no point really getting into spelling rules and morphology and etymology like we don't have those foundations. Those pieces are essential as well. We have to get those foundations. So the phonics instruction, the focus on articulation, it's really for the early grades, and I suppose for our children who need it later on as well, but that wouldn't be in the mainstream classroom setting.
It all goes back to that message in the beginning. We have to look at the students in front of us and try to give them the tools and the strategies that are going to be helpful for helping them tackle the code. So this has been such a great conversation, Dee. Where can listeners connect with you further?
Well, you can find me on most socials. So on Instagram, it's playful_classroom. My website is playfulclassroom.ie. Facebook, it's Playful Classroom. LinkedIn, it's Deirdre O'Toole. And of course, check out writetoreadireland.ie as well, because it's all very exciting.
So exciting. We're all going to be flying to Ireland next time.
All are welcome.
Yeah. Best of luck with your conference, and best of luck with the rest of your PhD journey.
Thanks so much.
Excited to connect soon.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for tuning into Literacy in Color. I hope today's episode left you feeling both inspired and equipped with something new to add to your teaching toolkit. If you're enjoying this podcast, it would truly mean so much to me if you'd leave a 5-star review. It helps other educators find the show and join our colorful community. And don't forget to hit the follow or subscribe button so you never miss an episode. For more tips, tools, and resources, be sure to check out the links in the show notes at michelleandthecolorfulclassroom.com. Thanks again for listening, and I'll catch you next week. Until then, be colorful and teach colorfully.